Hello, Cross Connectors. Natalie here. As we're about to head into the New Testament with our episode on the Acts of the Apostles, we want to reshare with you the episodes that we recorded earlier this year of the four Gospels. Yesterday, we shared the Gospel of Matthew. Today, we have for you the Gospel of Mark, and over the next couple of days, we will release again Luke and John. We're doing this so that they're at the top of your feed before we get to the Acts of the Apostles. If you want to get ahead and listen to them quickly, you can scroll back to April 21st for Luke and May 14th for John. We especially will commend to you our episode on the Gospel of Luke since, as you will hear in both that episode and the Acts one, they're by the same author. For today, here's the Gospel of Mark from March 10th, 2025. Enjoy this backtrack. Welcome to Cross Connections, Season 2, Cover to Cover, as we read along with you each week and discuss the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Join us as we discover how these stories connect us to God, to our inner selves, and to one another in a world that tries so hard to disconnect us. Welcome back, one and all, and welcome to this bonus episode on the Gospel of Mark.
I love bonus episodes.
Bonus.
So if you've been keeping up with the reading plan as intended, and really no shame if you haven't been.
I'm going to be honest. I think most people probably are not doing the New Testament reading. I'm happy to be contradicted by our listeners, but I think most people I talk to are like, yeah, I'm just focusing on the 3 chapters a day.
And that's fine. I mean, the whole reason I put that in there was just to give people a little respite if the Old Testament lesson was getting like too much,
right?
And didn't feel like it connected with life enough, and
right.
give you a little bit of Jesus to get you through.
Right,
so
right.
If you don't need that, then fine,
don't sweat it.
No problem.
Yep. Yeah, I know we heard from one of our listeners on the other side of the world that she was not keeping up, and that's okay.
No problem.
We forgive you.
No problem.
We don't even have to forgive you. It's not even something that requires forgiveness.
Yep. No.
But for those of you who are and have heard us tease that we're going to be doing this episode about the Gospel of Mark, here we are.
Mark really is my favorite gospel.
Is it?
It is, yes. Yeah.
And what makes it your favorite?
It's short, terse. Mm-hmm. It's a gospel of urgency. And I mean, not that I don't like the other gospels, but the other particularly like John, Luke are sort of like works of art. Mark is just getting it out there.
Yeah.
And I like that about him an awful lot.
Yeah. Mark is definitely the best gospel to recommend to someone that has never read any scripture at all or the Gospels, because it is the shortest. It is not in a negative way, but the most plain. Like you said, like if this were works of art, Mark is very minimalist.
Is he like a Mark Rothko?
Yeah, exactly. It's just like, a black screen. That's a good reference, Natalie. Yeah, it is kind of like that. And also I think maybe, this is not how the reading plan is set up. And this is true for all of the Gospels, but I think especially for Mark, but all of them, they're best read in one sitting. This is how these were intended to be read, right? Like the Gospel of Mark is not intended for you to sit and read like a chapter a day or a few chapters. Right. Like when this was written, the idea is this would have been read. Actually, it wouldn't even have been. It would have been spoken. It wouldn't have even been read. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So this would have been. You have to remember in this time there's a class of people that can read and write, and then the majority of people cannot read and write.
Right.
And so what would have happened is this would have been circulated among communities where someone was physically bringing it with them, traveling to these communities, and then reading it to them. And so for that reason, it's also important to remember like this, it's a story, it's a unified whole. And so really like you have to understand the whole story. And that's what makes Mark kind of the best. To Rick's point is like, it's the quickest and easiest one to read. It's the most like, okay, here's the story.
So we've already done Matthew, and if you read Matthew and then you read Mark, you will notice that there are some overlaps. I think we used the big word in the Matthew episode that this is a synoptic gospel. Matthew, Mark, and Luke see Jesus through the same eye, synoptic. So there's a lot of crossover, a lot of the same stories, not all of them. Some of the bits are even word for word, and when we get to John, we'll see that John is an outlier. In fact, there's very few stories that cross over between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John.
Yeah.
So what is the history of Mark? I know in our readings from the Torah, we've a few times referred to Mark as a trauma document.
Yeah.
So now that we're here and we're just talking about Mark.
So we think that Mark is the first gospel that is written, and we think that it was written around the year 70. And so let me just set a little context of what was going on. In the year 64, and in fact, July 18th of the year 64.
Very specific.
July 18th?
July 18th, 64, world event happened that you definitely have heard of. It is the burning of Rome. And when Rome was burning, who was fiddling?
I don't know.
No one
devil?
knows. Oh,
No.
okay. Wow.
Wait,
Nero.
no, that sounds familiar.
yeah.
Nero,
Nero
that's
was
right.
fiddling. Emperor Nero was fiddling.
Okay. I thought this was like a phrase, like a trick question. I was like, well,
No. Like,
the devil went down to Georgia.
that's
Who
a
was fiddling?
totally different story.
Sorry.
So Rome burns. The people of Rome are blaming Nero.
Yeah.
And Nero cannot
Nero's gotta
stand
find
that.
someone else to blame.
Right. Nero is going to find someone else. There's a game of hot potato. First, they try and put it off on the Jewish population of Rome. Like it's their fault. They don't follow our gods. They don't follow our religion. They don't honor the emperor as a god. And so it must be their fault. The Jewish population goes, well, it's not us. It's these Christians over here. And the first big persecution of Christians follows this. Roman soldiers would come to someone's door. They would knock on the door. You would answer the door. They would ask if you were a Christian. If you said no, well, if you said yes, you and your entire family were gone.
Yeah.
If you said no, you had to give someone else up as a Christian. I mean, it was this terrible, entire families against families were pitted against each other, all because of who they were. So 6 years after this horrific event happens, Rome destroys Jerusalem. There are two separate events. One did not cause the other,
right.
But Rome does destroy Jerusalem. Basically, they destroyed the temple for the last time. We've talked about this a couple times. There has been no temple since then. The Temple Mount is actually not even held by the Jewish people anymore.
Right.
So the nexus of these two horrific events, people felt like the world was ending. They felt like their world was ending.
Right.
They felt like, the forces of the universe were against them. And out of that, all that fear and anxiety, Mark writes this gospel, this good news.
Yeah.
Because of everything that's going on in the world, he tells it in a very swift manner, with an urgency, like we need to get this out. We also think that the very first Christians took Jesus's words that he was going to come back, that this generation would not pass before Jesus returned, before the Son of Man returned, that they took that pretty literally.
Yeah.
That they thought like Jesus is coming back and we're all out of here pretty quickly. And so Mark is probably also short for that reason. Like there's no reason for a long artistic document because we're not going to be here that long. By the time John writes his gospel 30 years later, people realized, oh, maybe that's not what Jesus meant.
Yeah.
And so we're going to be around here a little longer, and we need to establish this church a little more firmly. And so John writes a much more artistic gospel. And so I know I've been talking for a lot, and I'm going to say one more thing, and then I'll launch it back to you, is that not only is Mark's gospel short, and it doesn't have some things like we normally think about when we think about the story of Jesus, like there's no story of Jesus's birth.
Yep.
There's no story of his childhood. The first time we see him, he's a 30-year-old adult getting ready to be baptized. I'm sure we'll get into this a bit later, but there's no real full story of the resurrection. There's an account that he was resurrected, but there's no resurrection appearance in the original gospel of Mark. And there's a phrase that shows up over and over and over and over again in Mark. And that phrase is, and immediately. Everything in the gospel of Mark happens immediately. Now, in your English version of the Bible, that might be obscured because English translators try and make it interesting for us. And if they say the same thing over and over again, we get bored.
Yes, we editors like to fix that kind of thing.
So like
Quote, fix.
something happens suddenly, and then immediately, and then just then. But in the original Greek, it's like a drum beat. Kai uthos, kai uthos, kai uthos, and immediately, and immediately, and immediately. And so there is this urgency that is grafted into the gospel because the times were urgent.
Right. That's good. That is very good.
When you said that immediately was the refrain, the first thing I thought, and we don't have to go there right away, but the first thing I thought was, tell no one.
Yeah.
Because that gets repeated a bit.
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. Right. There's this one of the conventions of Mark is what's called the Messianic secret. And so Jesus will do this thing and he'll be like, don't tell anybody.
Yeah, right.
Which is the exact
Don't do
opposite
it.
of what we would think today. Like,
Yeah.
Don't tell them.
like there's this amazing thing about St. David's. Don't tell anybody. Right. That would be ridiculous.
It would be.
Natalie be without a job.
Right. Well, like what's the point of
Of a communications
person?
director.
And apart from all silliness, part of the theme is that people do not recognize correctly who Jesus is.
Yeah.
And first and foremost, the disciples do not recognize who Jesus is. And this ties into, we released an episode recently on Deuteronomy, and we talked about kings. There's also this category that arises in the Hebrew scriptures of a Messiah. And the expectation, by and large, was that this person that would rescue Israel, right? We have to remember this is written by Jews, for Jews.
Yep.
Israel is under imperial domination from Rome. They would have thought of this, right? In Deuteronomy, we talked a lot about exile. Exile was a result of covenant curses, of lack of obedience to God. So you have to realize people reading and living at the time of Jesus in the early first century would have been experiencing life as one of exile. They would have been thinking to themselves, we are still even today in exile, and we are awaiting deliverance from God. And we are awaiting a king, a Messiah. And the expectation was this would have been, and there were people before Jesus, right, that claimed to be this. There's, before Jesus, the Maccabean revolt, right? This is really important. At the time, Jews revolting against Rome, of trying to cleanse the temple, of throwing out Roman domination. Didn't end very well. But point being that there's an expectation that this person would have been a person of power, a person of might, a person that would have cast out Rome militarily.
Right.
And so, yeah,
A
there's
strong leader.
And so,
then Jesus shows up.
yeah, and then Jesus shows up.
And they were like, no, that's not what we were thinking.
Yeah, this isn't what we were expecting.
We didn't want a guy with long hair
Yeah.
and talking about loving everybody.
No.
Like, we want a little more action.
Right.
going
And so
on.
part of that, my point with all of that is this is kind of connected to the secret of him saying, like, don't tell him yet. People don't understand. The disciples themselves don't understand. There's the famous line in Mark 8, smack dab in the middle, where Peter pulls Jesus aside.
Well, Jesus says, here's who everyone else says that I am.
Right.
People are saying, who do you say that I am? And Peter says,
I don't think this is the same passage I'm thinking of.
Okay.
When Peter says, "You're the Christ."
yeah.
I can't find that. Find that for me, because the passage I'm thinking of is
8:27.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, you're right.
8:27,
Yes, this is yeah. We're talking about the same passage. He says, "You are the Messiah," and then he says, the verse says, this is sorry for people listening, we're talking about this without referencing it. This is chapter 8, around verse 27 to 30, and he's saying, people say, I'm John the Baptist, others say Elijah. Who do you say that I am? So this is the big question of the gospel, right? Like, this is the question that's even addressed us. Who do you say that I am? And Peter responds in a way that you're like, oh, he got it right on the dot. He says, you are the Messiah, right? Like, this is the expectation. And Jesus is enigmatic. He says, sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him.
Well, and the other interesting part about that is up to this point, there is no human that Jesus has encountered who has understood or said who Jesus is.
Right.
Up to this point in the gospel, the first 8 chapters, it is only the demons
Right.
who know who Jesus is. So Jesus will go, okay, remember we're in this like highly anxious time where everyone's scared, the world's ending. The beginning of the Gospel of Mark reads like the beginning of The Exorcist. I mean, Jesus is just casting out demons left and
right. Casting out demons.
And the demons keep being like, "You're the Christ. Like you're the Christ. Like don't do this to me or get me out of here." Like they know who Jesus is.
Right.
It's not until the very middle of the gospel. Like if you took the entire gospel and creased it down the middle, it would land on Peter's confession.
Right.
You're the Messiah. Finally, he knows.
And what's so funny is that he knows, but he still doesn't know because this passage is actually sandwiched by two moments where Jesus heals blindness, and there's actually this kind of like figurative literary device happening where Jesus is healing blindness around him, but on a deeper level there is a spiritual blindness of the disciples. So Peter says, "You are the Messiah." Jesus tells them not to tell anyone, and then it immediately says, and I think there's a juxtaposition here in 8:31. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man, which it's very important to note, Son of Man is not just saying Jesus was a man. This is from Daniel.
Right.
This is an expectation of kind of who the Messiah
like a messianic.
would be. Yeah, it's a messianic title. The Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected and be killed, and in 3 days rise again. And what does it say? It says he said all this quite openly. Peter took him and rebuked him.
Yeah.
So Peter's like, "You're the Messiah.
You can't be saying
and
this."
And to my point, it's like he's going, "What the
Get
heck are you
behind me,
talking about,
Satan."
Jesus? This is not what the Messiah does. The Messiah isn't killed.
Yeah.
You can imagine it, almost put it colloquially. He's like, "Jesus, what in the world? You're supposed to throw out Rome, man. You're supposed to be a king. We're going to crown you. We're going to go into Jerusalem. You are going to conquer Jerusalem, and Rome
we're going to take on Caesar, and we're getting our freedom back."
Yes, we are getting our freedom. And what does Jesus say to Peter? He says, "Get behind me, Satan."
So he gets it, like you're the Messiah.
Right.
He gets the right answer.
Right.
But he doesn't understand what the Messiah is.
He's still blind.
Yeah.
Just like Bartimaeus is blind, and Bartimaeus calls out to Jesus. This is in chapter 10. This kind of bookends this area of Mark. Bartimaeus calls out to Jesus, and he, in messianic ways too, he says, Son of David, heal me." And then Jesus heals his blindness. I think that's the end of chapter 10.
Think about the people not writing about Jesus's lifetime, which is around the year 30-ish. But it's being written around 70. So 40 years later, you have a people who are scared to death because they think the world is ending, right? They have just lost. They've lost in Rome. They've lost in Jerusalem. And Jesus starts talking about how he is going to lose.
Yeah.
And so it's like Jesus is identifying, the Jesus of Mark is identifying with the Christians that will be living 40 years later.
Right.
As if to say, even when you're losing, you are still on my side. You haven't walked out of the favor of God. You haven't walked out of the presence and the hope of God, because the gospel is in some ways about losing.
Yeah.
It's about going to the cross.
Right. This is an important time to say that in the gospels, winning and losing and power are radically redefined.
Turned completely upside down.
There's a famous phrase, and Rick, you've probably heard it a million times. Natalie, I'd be interested if you've heard this before, but people love to talk about the upside down kingdom.
Yeah. Oh yes, I keep hearing about.
Yeah,
yes,
right. I mean, this is like it's the buzzy catchword for the last 15 years or something. But the idea that Jesus's kingdom is an upside down kingdom, and meaning that Jesus really radically flips on its head these notions of kingship, power, winning and losing, right? Like we follow a Palestinian Jew that was crucified on a cross and claims that is a form of victory. This is like deeply paradoxical. So I think that's spot on, Rick. I want to talk about something really kind of nerdy, if I'm allowed to.
Yeah, bring it on.
Maybe a little bit nerdy, but maybe a misconception people have when reading the Gospels. I know I certainly had it as a young person, which is two titles used throughout all of the Gospels and used in Mark as well, which are Son of God and Son of Man. We just referenced these a little bit.
Yeah.
And so I think traditionally, English-speaking person reading this in English, maybe you haven't read a lot of the Old Testament, you immediately see those and you're like, oh, these are the titles that, I'm a Christian. I believe Jesus was God and man. So these are the titles that say Jesus was a human and also God. I want to bring this up because, let me just put it bluntly, that is not at all what these titles are about.
Right.
There's no connection at all to Jesus's quote unquote divinity or humanity.
Not at all.
So to just say, you see this immediately off the bat. The Gospel of Mark starts in verse 1 with the sentence, the beginning of the good news. We talked about what good news means in our Matthew episode. Go listen to that. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ. Also important to say, Christ is not Jesus' last name.
Nope. Jesus and Mary Christ did not have Jesus Christ. It's a title.
This is a
Right.
title. Christ is a
Means
title.
Messiah,
It means
anointed
Messiah,
one.
Lord, anointed one. Comes from the Greek word kurios, right?
Yep.
And Christos. So, and then right after that, Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And so again, it's important to remember, Rick mentioned, there's no birth narrative. There's no like incarnational kind of virgin conception in Mark, which is really interesting to think about, especially given that we think this was the first gospel. And this phrase, Son of God, is actually a phrase from, and this is why we're encouraging people to read the Old Testament, from the Old Testament, that Israel is described as God's son.
son.
David is described as God's son. So it's to some degree, it's a messianic kingly title.
Yep.
So if you go read the second Psalm, Psalm 2. This is a Davidic royal psalm. And in that psalm, David is described as God's son. And so that's where this language of Son of God comes from. It's a Davidic, somewhat messianic title. It's not a title about like Jesus being divine. Son of Man, on the other hand, is also a messianic title that comes from the middle of Daniel.
One like a son of man.
One like a son of man coming on clouds. And so the Son of Man is a term for, in Daniel, there's these visions of someone, it's kind of enigmatic, that will come and deliver Israel from oppression. And so that's where this phrase, the Son of Man, comes from. So that's all, and I'm nerding out about all of this because I don't want to rock the boat too much here.
Watch it. Watch it.
Rick's squinting at me.
I'm just sitting here listening fascinated because I've not heard any of this.
Yeah, there's a very interesting scholarly question. This is just scholarly and nerdy about how exactly did the early Christians understand Jesus's divinity.
Yeah.
And there is an ongoing scholarly discussion about, did they understand at the earliest stages, did they believe that Jesus was fully divine? And I'm not saying that, I'm not saying, I'm not questioning it. I'm not trying to like say that to scare anyone, but it's a very interesting conversation about, was this something that was understood early on, or did it have to kind of develop?
It definitely, whether they had that like in the background,
right?
We don't know, but the way they talked about it and the way they began to put that out there definitely developed.
Right.
So another nerdy word, Christology, which is the study of Christ, how we understand Christ. If you look at the Christology of Mark, the first written gospel, and then you look at the Christology of the Gospel of John, the last gospel written, like you have what's called a higher Christology in John. By John, 30 years later, they have figured more stuff out.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Those are the nerdy words.
But here, what they're doing is the important thing that Mark was trying to do wasn't that wasn't a question he was interested in asking.
Exactly.
That's what I was going to say. It doesn't sound like that's even what he cares about.
Not even on his radar, whether like we have to define whether he's divine or not and how we do that. What he wants to do is connect Jesus up with these titles from the Old Testament.
Yes.
And remember, in this day, there aren't, like today, Judaism and Christianity, two different religions.
Yep.
Right? Sibling religions, and we try and get along, but we're two different religions. In Mark's day, there were Jews.
Yep.
And then there were Jews who followed Jesus. That was it.
Yeah.
And so for the Jews who are following Jesus, they are connecting Jesus in with these titles that they already knew from their scriptures. Right. Mark is writing a piece of scripture, but he doesn't know he's writing scripture. He just, if you told him we would be reading his book 2,000 years from now, he'd be blown away. Right. But what he's doing is he is connecting Jesus in with these titles and these figures that we see in the Old Testament, saying who Daniel was talking about, who we were talking about in the Old Testament is Jesus.
Right. Yes. And I'm so glad you said that, because again, it shows the utter value of working through these, what we call Old Testament scriptures, because the book literally starts with a quote from Isaiah.
Oh, yeah.
And titles taken right from various books of the Old Testament. And to your point, Rick, I think the concern, I brought all of this up to say there is today, a sort of apologetic concern of like, how do we understand Jesus's like divinity and humanity? And what Mark is really concerned with in his Jewish context is less that question, not that it's an unimportant question, but one of identification with Yahweh, with the God of Israel.
Yep.
And so again, we have that quote right in the beginning from Isaiah where the emphasis is prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his paths. And this is a quote from Isaiah that is, again, going back to this theme of exile. It's about return from exile. Like this is the concern. And we see that in Mark through the language of, we talked about in Matthew, the kingdom of heaven. In Mark, we see the language of the kingdom of God. And the theme for Mark is this return from exile in which the kingdom of God is at hand, right? So immediately in the beginning, we get John in the wilderness saying, repent and believe, the kingdom of God is at hand. And then you talked about the urgency of Mark, which is that the kingdom of God has arrived. In the person of Jesus, exile is being done away with. The kingdom of God is being brought in a way we never expected, but nonetheless being brought in. And that this, and the question is, how are you going to respond to the arrival of the kingdom of God in your midst?
That is the question that Mark is wrestling with.
Yes.
Not the later concerns of divinity and humanity.
Right.
Christianity will get there.
Yes.
But here it's about connecting.
Right. It's not like, was Jesus, was Jesus's mom virgin, was she a virgin that was conceived? And that doesn't even matter at this point yet. Right.
Right.
What I think is really interesting about Mark and how active it is, it's really action-packed. He's doing one thing after another, healing people, driving out demons, teaching them something. And it felt like it had sections like, okay, now we're in the we're healing everybody section, and now we're in the trying to get the disciples to understand section, and now we're in the, okay, now we're overturning tables section, and now we're in the, okay, disciples, this is really happening. And then we get into, end times speech, and then we get into the passion. What I was just thinking about as you were talking, Elliot, is how the Gospel of Mark's, it's all the stuff that's not in the Nicene Creed, in our creeds. You think about like when we speak our creeds and I believe in God and all that, it leaves out all the activity of Jesus's life. But Mark, that's the concern, is like the activity of Jesus's life and what that means for us, that this is the way that he lived and what he did and how he taught us to be.
Yeah.
Rather than all those other questions that we were saying about the Christology that comes so much later.
The Nicene Creed's written like 270 years later.
Yeah,
right.
So much later.
There are just different concerns and different emphases that the church is trying to make. If the creed was written in the year 70, it would be a different creed. If the Gospel of Mark was written in 325, when the Nicene Creed was drafted, Mark would be a different.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
They're each creatures of their time.
Maybe just to say some other big picture stuff about Mark, I think to this distinctiveness of Mark, and you talking about it as one of your favorites, Rick, I think one of the things that makes it one of my favorites, and you mentioned this a little bit, but the darkness that is within Mark.
The demons.
Yeah, the demons, the sense of despair, right? That this is at an early stage. Like you said, this was written very early. And there's a sense of shock that this is not what we ever would have expected. And you see that even in Mark's portrayal of the crucifixion, right? Where in the crucifixion in Mark 15, so this is Mark 15 around, this segment is kind of 33 and following. In Mark 15:34, I think the beauty of having these three synoptic gospels that Rick references, they all kind of have their own take on the crucifixion and the importance of the crucifixion and what happened at the crucifixion. Mark's perspective is that it's a moment of abandonment. And so Jesus quotes Psalm 22, and he says, at 3:00, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, quotes Aramaic there. You only get Aramaic a few times throughout the Gospels. This was the language Jesus would have spoken. This would have been the colloquial speak of the day. And he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Just the darkness of that cry, right? It's a very famous passage, but just the depths of despair where Mark almost has Jesus himself questioning. This is what's called a lament psalm, Psalm 22. Yeah. And it is important to remember that I'd have to go flip to it, but Psalm 22, as many lament psalms, does not end in lament.
It ends in,
right. It ends in God's faithfulness and what we would call God's resurrection. But nonetheless, that this is the passage Mark turns to for the crucifixion, is this moment of deep abandonment and despair, which to me just plumbs the depth of the human experience of suffering in a way you maybe don't get elsewhere.
There's also twice Jesus takes the disciples to the Sea of Galilee when there's one time when there's a storm and he has to still the storm. There's another time that the wind is blowing and scaring everybody, and Jesus has to still that. He stills the storm in Mark 4. He stills the sea in Mark 6. In Mark 8, he takes them to Caesarea Philippi, which is the worldwide headquarters of the Pan cult. He keeps taking his disciples to the place of danger.
Yeah.
He doesn't take them away from the place of danger. He takes them like into the mouth of danger, and yet he remains with them. Which, you ever had like a rough time in your life and you've questioned, why is this happening to me? I'm a good Christian.
Yeah, right.
I'm reading the Bible from cover to cover.
Right.
I work at a church. Why is this thing happening to me? God does not protect us from the hard things happening to us.
Right.
God walks with us through the hard things that happen to us.
Right.
Which is why, and if you think about in the year 70, when Mark is writing this to his people, the people are going through this dark, dark period. And why did this happen to us? Well, God didn't save you from this horrible thing, but God is still with you.
That's a great point, Rick.
Are we ready to talk about Mark 16? Or do we have something before that?
The only other thing I was going to add was that the my God, why have you forsaken me? Is, you said it's very famous. It's famous in a lot of ways, but it is one of the 7 last words of Christ. We are in Lent, and that is a popular. There's an orchestral piece, the 7 last words of Christ. That's done in a place I used to work at. Would do a reflection on each of the 7 last words of Christ, like spoken reflections on each of the words. Accompanied with a quartet.
Yeah, that's great.
Interesting little tidbit. Yeah, so here we are, the end of Mark.
Well,
now.
I wanted to say one thing before the end, based on your comments, Rick, about suffering, and that, again, with Jesus crying out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? That this is a cry of deeply human experience, a cry that many listening and ourselves here talking have probably experienced to some degree, a sense of forsakenness. And I think this is, to me, one of the great paradoxes of faith is the mystery of suffering, and often our human desire to see suffering as an imputation of our own actions. And I think the Gospel of Mark destabilizes that in some ways. And also, I think often we have an understanding of, like you said, Rick, if I'm a good Christian, if I follow all the rules, like blessing will accrue to me. And I think that is really an impossible perspective when you read the Gospel of Mark. And I'm thinking about in the middle of the Gospel, which we talked about, and you talked about, this is actually after he has taken them to Caesarea Philippi. It says in Mark 8, verse 34, he calls a crowd together with his disciples, and he says to them very famously, if any of you want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. And I think
upside down.
We talked about the upside down kingdom, the way Jesus is destabilizing these typical human notions of blessing and flourishing and power and what it means to gain your life or lose your life. And I think the hard reality, there's a quote I think about often from Eugene Peterson where he's talking about why he became a priest. And he says in response, there are a lot of crosses in the world. And I became a priest because I don't want to stand by idly in the midst of these crosses within the world. And to me, it's a reminder of Jesus talking about taking up your cross, that as Christians reading the Gospel of Mark, we believe that as crazy as this is to say, the experience of crucifixion is not one reserved only for Jesus.
Yes.
Right? I mean, here he is saying, if you follow me, you will take up your cross. And we believe that this isn't necessarily historical, but we believe to some degree that many of the apostles were crucified, killed, martyred. And so I was talking to Thomas the other day, one of our priests, Thomas. He has a great line where he's like, what makes you think you would be exempt from that, right?
Yep.
Like, and I, I'd put it broadly of like, what makes you think you'd be exempt from suffering in the world? There's nothing in Mark that would lend itself to that. Mark is very clear. There will be suffering. And to me, that is not, I don't mean to sound dreary or dark or cynical, right? Because there is hope in the midst of suffering, as you eloquently put it, that God journeys with us and goes with us, and that there is hope on the other side of suffering, right? Like that is the ultimate hope. But it is a good reminder for us that the Christian life, the faith life, is not one without suffering. So I'll stop rambling about suffering, but...
Yeah, it's not one without suffering, but it's also not that you're expected to have to suffer needlessly, or that suffering noticed should go just allowed to continue on its way.
No.
So it's always that like, yes, there will be suffering, we'll walk through suffering. And when we see suffering, we are still
work to
alleviate it, not just let it go because that's just the way it's going to be.
Right. No, that's such a great point. This is not, and these comments can quickly be taken in that direction, a glorification of suffering, right? Like, I think, despite the fact that often today we wear crosses, part of what Mark presents us with and the gospel traditions present us with is that this is an unimaginable evil, crucifixion, right? That this is not something that is celebrated. So But
when you end up in that dark day, you have not been abandoned.
Right. That you are not abandoned.
You, like Jesus, may feel like you have been abandoned. That experience is real, very real, but our faith says you, in the end, have not been abandoned.
Right. The end, chapter 16.
And this flows right in because Mark gives us kind of a dark ending with a little glimmer of hope. Mm-hmm. So one of the more well-known features of Mark, and if you look at your own copy of the Gospel of Mark, you will notice that there are several endings to the Gospel of Mark. I remember when I was a kid, I'm older than you guys, we had choose your own adventure books.
Oh, those were so fun.
Yeah.
I loved
so like you read a page and then you like chose whether you flipped to that page. So like Mark has an ending and then a shorter ending and then a longer ending. And what scholars are almost unanimous on is that Mark's gospel ends at the eighth verse, and that anything written after that was added on because the gospel ends at the very terse
infamously.
Infamously. And so as it ends, the women go to the tomb. They get there. They see a young man seated in the tomb, covered with a white robe. They're amazed. He says, "Don't be amazed. You look for Jesus, the crucified. He has been raised. He isn't here." And the ending verse of the Gospel of Mark is, "Exiting, they fled from the tomb, for they had tremble and ecstasy, and they said nothing to no one, for they were afraid." Period. End of gospel. And so we get this little glimmer that he has risen. But unlike the other gospels, no resurrection appearance. He's not appearing in the road to Emmaus. He's not appearing in the upper room. There's no scene with Thomas, the doubter, like where he finally gets to put his hand in the side and believe. None of that.
Yeah.
But we get this word that there is resurrection, and then we get the women running away because they are scared. And I can understand why the people then decided that they needed a longer a longer ending. Like, we gotta like close this up and make this a little neater. And so they do, and they write in a resurrection appearance in Mark, but Mark does not end with that like full-throated like trumpets and lilies. He ends with like a glimmer of hope, like around the corner.
Right.
We have heard that Jesus has been raised from the dead, but we haven't seen it yet.
Right.
Similarly, you have these Christians living in the wake of horrific times, and they don't know how that story is going to end, but they're being told that hope with God is around the corner.
Right. And that's such a great point, Rick. The ending of Mark is very famous for this. And for the history nerds that may be listening, in terms of if you're thinking like, what do you mean there's one ending and then another ending? Like, how does that even happen? it might be important to remind people all the way back from our intro episodes of like how we got the Bible, that the Bible we have today is based on ancient manuscripts. Some are older than others.
Yep.
These manuscripts are written on papyrus. We do not have original manuscripts, meaning like
Not
ones
a
that we
single
can
one.
we can date to like the year 70, right?
Right.
So, but if you are a history nerd, you know papyrus expires, it degrades, and so we have ones that are older because copies were constantly being written, right? You didn't just,
Yep.
it's not like on a computer, you write one file, you save it, it's there for eternity. It was like, no, they were constantly writing and circulating papyri copies. And so this is all a way of saying the most ancient papyri we have of the Gospel of Mark ends at verse 8. And what this tells us is that most likely, given all of the different papyrus sources, ancient sources we have, which we have many, it's not like there's 5, right? There's thousands. The most ancient ones end at verse 8. Later ones that are rooted to clearly later traditions of copies, have these alternative endings, these longer endings. And what that tells us is that most likely, if you're reading a study Bible, for example, there will be a little note that explains all this, and it will say, mine says along the lines of, most scholars believe that this longer ending would have been added in the 2nd or 3rd century. Again, to Rick's point, to kind of clean
200
up.
years later.
Yeah. To kind of clean up, like, we don't really like that the last ending is that people are afraid. Nah, that's not, we don't.
Yep.
And you know, so they're adding to it. So that's kind of the background in terms of like how this materially would have happened.
I love that you said that.
Yeah. Fun.
One of the things I think about when I think about Mark is that, you know, we have 4 gospels. And so we have this one, but we can like fill in the parts that it misses with, you know, Matthew and Luke and
Right.
John. But if we only had Mark, if Mark was the only gospel that somehow survived, think about how different Christianity would be. There would be no Christmas.
No Christmas.
That's true.
Because there is no story of Jesus' birth. There's no
No
manger,
epiphany.
no magi,
epiphany, yeah.
no
Nope.
star in the sky. And Easter would be like,
Very different tradition.
be different.
Yeah.
I
It'd
don't
be-
know it'd be quite as like joyful. Like, I don't know.
There wouldn't be as many trumpets, I don't
No.
think, because there's an announcement and then this like question, like, whoa, what's next?
Right.
What does this mean? And clearly, what does this mean was a question on their minds for some time, given that we ended up with 3 other gospels that
Exactly
go
right.
a little further and try to answer
yeah.
that question a little more fully.
That's true.
And tell us a little bit more about what happened after they ran off.
Right.
I think sometimes so much about the fear, like fill in the story, right? What was it like for those people who witnessed Christ's crucifixion and then had to wait those days and then are still waiting, and then, you know, they see this thing that
Yeah.
Defies all logic.
Defies all logic.
Right.
People don't come back from the dead except for the ones that Jesus rose.
Right.
What a series of things to go
And no one
through.
was expecting it. I mean, Jesus talks about it all. It's like, I'm going to die and I'm going to rise again on the 3rd day, blah, blah, blah. And the disciples are like, yeah. They are not expecting it.
Yeah.
No one goes to that tomb like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think he
Maybe
might have
he's there,
risen.
yeah.
No, they all go to the tomb with their spices because they know his body
They're
is
there
there.
to treat the body of the dead the way that
because
you would.
Dead bodies stay dead.
Right.
We all know this.
Right.
And so they go to the tomb expecting fully, and all of their expectations are blown away.
Yeah, I think it is important to say that because I think we so often read the Gospels with like, oh yeah, you know, that's what the Messiah does. He's crucified and raised again. And I think it's just so important to recognize that for these people, this was so utterly different than what they were expecting.
Right.
I love the ending of the Gospel of Mark, speaking of like different valences, because if you remember, there's the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, and I love what they say, which is that we thought he was the Messiah. We thought he was.
That's right.
But and if you remember, there's the who is it?
and
Opens the scriptures for them. It talks about it
hearts
is
are-
Jesus. Yeah, that's right. Who is it? I said
Of course, it's,
like who is it that
they
did that
don't.
again?
They just like you didn't recognize
Yeah,
him
right.
at
They didn't
first.
recognize him. Yeah, and I love that. It's like, oh, we thought he was the one who was going to save Israel. I think
And
it
they're-
says
and they're
something like that.
disappointed.
Yeah, they're
They're
very. It
disappointed.
says they're disappointed. Yes. Yeah.
And even knowing, they then said, but there are some women who went to the tomb and said he has risen from the dead. But so obviously obviously they don't believe that.
Yeah, they're like, and obviously that's absurd.
Come on,
you
it's
know, like
ridiculous.
get real.
Right.
Though, I'm sorry, while we're
Can't
nerding
believe
out,
the word
there's-
of a woman. Ah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Which
that too.
that's important to say as well about all of our gospel testimonies, including Mark, the role of women. You know, that this was definitely a radical thing at this time and in the Gospels, that it is the women who are the first to preach the good news that Jesus is risen from the dead.
To witness the risen Christ.
I always feel like the end of Mark bids us to like think about what the next verses are, because like the women
Yeah.
leave fear and trembling. They say nothing to no one because they're scared to death. Obviously, they did tell somebody something.
Yeah, right.
Or the next gospel wouldn't have been written, and the next gospel
Right.
wouldn't have been written, and we wouldn't be sitting here doing a podcast about this.
Right.
Like, obviously,
Exactly. Yeah.
the women told someone.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. Speaking of like just quirks, there's two things I'm thinking of right now that are just my brain's pulling out random things, but I love the longer ending, which part of it is not only about the manuscript, it's about the fact that like nothing in it fits with the rest of the Gospel of
at
Mark.
all. It
Which
is.
kind of tells us, like this was added in
It's
a
a
later
different
century.
Christology.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
and I love this line where it's talking about like, you know, so it went from terror and fear and being afraid and not saying anything to anyone. And then in the longer ending, it's talking about like what believers will do, what people that follow Jesus will do. And it's like, they'll
snakes.
cast out demons, they'll speak in tongues, they'll handle snakes. It literally says, they will drink deadly poison and nothing will hurt them. You know, which is
I'm pretty sure that's not what happens to those guys.
which is also funny. It's like, this is not quite what happens. Also, the drinking poison thing is really weird because like, and the snakes one is really weird because like that literally happens nowhere else in the New Testament. Like this is very bizarre. This is certainly from later centuries of just like kind of interpolation of like, oh, this would have happened. The other thing,
But it's where snake handling comes from.
it's where snake handling comes from.
I went to seminary in the South, and there
Yeah.
were always like little trips that the seminarians would take to the
Yeah.
snake handling churches in southern Georgia.
Yep. And like church revival, tent revival, Pentecostal is the phrase for some of the folks that do this. Yeah, they literally think you could handle snakes and you'll be okay.
Well,
That's
some
wild.
people do learn how to do that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, these are not trained snake
These are
handlers.
the snake
the-
I'm thinking of some great things we could do here at St. David's in Lent. I think we bring in some snakes.
Bring in some snakes.
and,
Let people start picking them up.
Yeah.
This could be
Sure,
exciting.
that'll go well for your job, Rick.
We're going to lay
Excellent.
hands on the sick.
One other thing I'm randomly thinking about, going back to our comments about resurrection. The thing that I always think is fascinating is Jesus is not the first account of resurrection in Scripture, in either the New Testament or the Old Testament. So in the Old Testament, I'm trying to remember, I always mix them up. There's Elijah and then there's Elisha.
Yep.
And one of them resurrects a young boy.
We haven't gotten there yet. No fair,
I know.
Elliot.
And then of course in the gospel accounts, Jesus resurrects at least two people that
Lazarus
I can think of.
and the daughter.
Lazarus
So-
and then
Jairus'
Jairus' daughter.
So here's the question, though. Are those resurrections? And what is resurrection?
Well, this is why I'm bringing this up.
Of
Oh,
course.
man.
Because-
Trixie.
I know. I am prone to say it is resurrection, right? Like this is not just like revivification. This is, you know, part of, at least with the gospel accounts, like part of the claim is that with the inbreaking of God, there is this new life that's being brought in that has even the power to raise Lazarus from the dead, for example, right? And to heal the blind. There are these like proleptic first tastes of resurrection as well, and the healings. But yeah, I mean, it does raise the questions you raise, Rick, which is always so funny because you don't think about this often with those resurrections, but those people died again.
They died again.
Right? They died again.
And we finish
Oh,
almost
right.
every prayer in our liturgies with Jesus who lives
Yeah,
and
right,
reigns.
right.
Right. And so like there is no tomb that you can go
Right.
to and like memorialize Jesus
Right.
because he is not there.
Right.
Right.
Jesus is kind of taken up, like that one person that was randomly taken up in Genesis.
Yeah.
Remember, is it
Enoch.
that- or
Enoch.
Enoch.
Yeah.
Right.
And then Elijah.
And then Elijah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, which, you know, is memorialized in Acts. This is, we call this, the big fancy word as Christians, is the ascension, that Jesus ascends into heaven. To the author of Acts talks about it as Jesus is seated at the right hand of God, ruling with God. I don't have much to say about it, but I always think about that with this whole resurrection thing. It is, on the one hand, right, like there was no expectation of this. This made no sense to them. But it is funny, like they were aware of these people that Jesus raised, Jesus talks throughout the gospel about the Son of Man will suffer and be raised on the third day. And of course, they never understood, which is part of the irony at play.
But there's no followers of Lazarus.
No, there's no followers of Lazarus. That's right.
The widow's son.
Right.
Or
right. Right.
Well, they didn't do all of the same things that Jesus did. They didn't, heal people,
Right.
cast out demons,
Right. Yeah.
teach, prophesy.
I think about those as resuscitations.
Interesting.
And that they do show Jesus and God's power over life and death. But that the difference in what we would Christians call resurrection
Right.
is the destruction of death
Right.
itself.
Right.
And so death is pulled out of the equation.
Right.
And which is why Jesus can live.
Right. That's a great point. Yeah, you're probably onto something there.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of differences in the circumstances of those other deaths. Like I think Jairus' daughter had only just died. Lazarus was dead. Lazarus was dead
4
enough that it
days.
Yeah,
stank.
a couple days.
He
days.
He stinketh.
He
Yeah.
stinketh.
Like, and that's why, especially with the Lazarus one, I think of resurrection more than resuscitation. There's this sense with Lazarus. Yeah, right. Like he's dead for a few days, and he's risen up. But it is, yeah, like you said, even if we talk about it as resurrection, it is resurrection of a totally different order, and that's why I love thinking about like Lazarus died again, right?
Yeah.
Which
Yeah, where's the account of that?
No, there is no
isn't.
account.
I was going to say that I didn't think there was,
the
but
account
we're
is-
just
but
assuming.
He's not walking around.
But he's-
Last time I checked.
Well,
with
if
the
you've
exception
watched
of,
any vampire stuff,
Okay.
let me tell you, Lazarus comes up a lot if you're into vampire
Yeah,
things.
yeah. Paul resurrects in Acts. I love that story. The man that falls out of the window from his
Paul's
long
boring sermon.
Yeah,
That's
he's,
right.
Rick's had a few of those, right? Where someone falls, they're so bored.
Wait, Rick's had a few long, boring
yeah,
sermons?
yeah,
That's
where someone
exact-
fell
yeah,
out the window
of course.
and died, and then Rick
They fell
resurrected
asleep.
them.
Yeah. It happens
Yeah,
almost
so it
every
is-
Sunday at 8:00.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Yep. So anyway, enough of silly
I thought this was going to be a
resurrection.
short episode on a short gospel. We had a lot to talk about.
We don't know how to stop.
No,
That's
there's too
true.
much fun stuff happening here.
That's true.
There's we didn't even talk about the Roman soldier that's like, this is the Son of God when Jesus is crucified.
It's okay. We have time. We're going to come back to Mark again.
We have 3 more
I
times.
know. We'll talk about.
Did
it
we
in the
leave
next
anything
one.
left?
I don't know.
Any meat and less bone?
There might not be too much more.
Oh, I think so.
I think
Besides,
so.
our listeners are going to
Flood
write
us
an
with
email.
questions.
Yeah.
They're going to email and call
right.
in with all kinds of questions about, tell me about this and Mark, and what is with that apocalyptic story in there. We could talk more about that, sure.
I can't wait.
We love to listen to ourselves talk.
That's right.
That's why we do a podcast. Thank you for coming along on this Mark-filled journey with us, folks.
Always fun. Don't tell anyone about Jesus.
And do it immediately.
Right.
Please ignore him. All right. We'll see you next time, folks. Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cross Connections Cover to Cover. New episodes drop each Wednesday. Please be sure to follow or like us on your favorite podcasting app to find us easily each week, or join us on our email list at stdavidschurch.org/crossconnections. If you have questions for us, you can call us at 484-588-5656 and leave a voicemail with your name, where you're from, and your question or comment. Please note, we may use your recorded voice in an upcoming episode of Cross Connections. If you like what you hear, we'd love if you would share this with your friends and rate us in Spotify and Apple Podcasts or whatever other app you're using so people can find us as well. Don't forget to visit our show notes for the year's reading list and any other resource links we've mentioned. Cross Connections is a ministry of St. David's Episcopal Church in Wayne, Pennsylvania. Season 2 Cover to Cover is hosted by
Rick Morley.
Elliot Van Hoy.
and Natalie Hill. Logo graphic design and podcast production by Natalie Hill. Stock media music provided by Marscott and Mood Mode Pond 5. You're welcome to learn more about all of St. David's worship and ministries at stdavidschurch.org.